Good morning, friends. Let us understand about another important topic under the business communication. The title of this particular session or the chapter would be Barriers of Communication Skill. I believe that your people must have gone through the first chapter of communication skill, which was with the title Communication and Overview. Just to recall, we talked about the basic introduction of communication. Then we discussed about the various principles. Do you remember the acronym IMPRESS? Later, we talked about the basic forms of communication, which is verbal as well as non-verbal, the process of communication, and finally, the myth and realities of communication. If you remember, we talked about process under the topic process. We were discussing about noise, and I very clearly stated that if you really want to have very strong or good communication and a clarity in your communication, you have to avoid noise. Why did I say so? The reason is very simple. When we talk about noise, it acts as a barrier. Yes, you heard me right. It acts as a barrier, and that is the chapter title. That is what we are going to discuss about barriers of communication. Is it only noise that acts as a barrier? If you think so, you're wrong. You have to understand that there can be different elements, there can be different factors which can create the gap in the communication. Before we are going to get into the details of this particular chapter titled Barriers and Aids to Communication, let us understand what is the learning outcome of this particular chapter. So moving ahead, once when we talk about the learning outcomes of this particular chapter or the objectives that we are going to discuss in this particular chapter, we are going to talk about the barriers of communication. Then we are going to identify the various barriers of communication. Also, we will explain you, or I am going to explain with the help of certain slides, that how these barriers, which could be either from the sender's point of view or from the receiver point of view, you can overcome. And what are the golden principles? What are the 7 golden principles of communication that we have to keep in our mind when we want to create that impress, that when we want to create that right information in the mind of the receiver. And finally, we are going to talk about the 10 commandments of communication. So moving ahead in this chapter, the content that we are going to cover would be the introduction of the barrier of communication, the center, or that is the sender's oriented barriers, the receiver's oriented barriers, the principles of communication, the talk tactics, the way we talk, the way we perceive our message, and the way we deliver our messages based on our mind, the psychology, what are those, and then the 10 commandments of communication for in order to create that empathetic image, or in order to create that right image on the mind, what are the 10 commandments that we have to follow. So moving ahead, when we talk about barriers of communication, generally noise. When we talk about noise, noise of course is a barrier, but as I said, is that the only barrier in communication? No. You're hearing me right. I am saying that noise is only a part of the barrier. There can be different reasons for those different barriers of communication. You can see very clearly on this particular slide that when we talk about barriers of communication, it could be environmental barriers. It could be the barriers which are created because of the wrong choice of medium. Then it could be semantic, that is related to the logical inference that is created when you hear a word, when you hear a statement. There can be certain cultural barriers. There could be psychological or attitudinal barriers. And there can again be certain barriers which is because of the wrong perception. So how can we avoid these? How can we eliminate these? How can we identify the kind of barrier and try to overcome them? But before we go into the details, we always understand that if we are talking about communication, it's a two-way process. There is a receiver and there is a sender. Now, if we are talking about the process of communication, and when we talk about sender, what are those barriers which are generated from the sender's point of view? What are those senders miscommunication or the gap creation which is done by the sender? The first one is groping for the right message. You can see the reason for its cause is lack of preparation. Whenever we don't prepare ourselves in a proper way, we find difficult to connect the dots. We find difficult to connect the words. We find difficult to connect the statement, or even it becomes very difficult for paraphrasing. So therefore, if you really want to create that right impact and you want to avoid the barrier in your thoughts, in your ideas, you need to have that clarity. In order to overcome that, you need to structure, you need to restructure your thoughts so that whatever you want to communicate is communicated with the right information and in the right manner. The second part is superior attitude. Many a times we think I am the best. Whatever I say is easily understood by others. You're wrong. The kind of statement that you make and the kind of notion that other person is going to receive, there can be a big difference between these two. So therefore, if you think you are good at communication and people will listen and understand, you're wrong. So if you really want to improve your communication, you need to avoid the feeling of superiority. That is the biggest reason why most of the time, even the good communicators, they find very difficult to communicate. When I say good communicator, they can be very strong in speech, they can be very good at words, they can be very good at grammar, they have very strong confidence, but trust me, their confidence gets shattered when the listener or the receiver says, I'm sorry, I did not understand, or I'm sorry, I understood it in this way. So there is a problem with the sender. So you have to address this problem. And how could we address this problem? When we understand the view of the receiver. Once when you understand the view of receiver, it becomes very easy for you to communicate in the right way. The third is lack of collaborative effort. You need to understand sender can only send when he or she understands the receiver's perspective or who the receiver is. Similarly, receiver can accept your message only when he or she can build up or bridge up the gap between his thought and the sender's thought. So therefore, there has to be a proper understanding. Always remember here, the role of empathy will help you a lot. Instead of having I attitude, that means thinking about you and from your angle, you better think it from the perspective of the receiver. Always go ahead with you attitude. Let me explain it to you. When I'm teaching or when I am delivering a virtual class or taking up this lesson, if I believe I know this, my students will also be knowing this. Trust me, I will be doing injustice with my students, because if I know, it doesn't mean that you know. So therefore, I have to always interpret what is it that students may not be knowing, and then based on those assumptions, I have to deliver my lecture. So here, my focus is on you instead of I. So that is what when I meant you attitude. The next is mental block. Many of us, we have this. We find it very difficult to deliver because of that mental blockage that we are having in our mind. So because of that preconceived notion, preconceived ideas, we find it very difficult to communicate. We have to get rid of that. How can we do that? When we assess the situation, when we understand the importance of people and their behavior, their way of taking the things, the way of carrying the action, the way they are going to accept the things. So once when we understand these, ultimately, we will be in a better position to communicate in a better way. Lack of language skills. You may be very good at writing, but you don't know how to convey your information in words. Or you may be very good in words, but you don't have that right expressions. You have a flat tone, you have a flat expression, which is very difficult for others to interpret. At that time, it becomes very difficult for the receiver to understand what you are trying to convey. So always remember, whenever you are communicating, you should have the good language skills. When I say good language skills, I'm talking about having the familiarity with the language. If you are unfamiliar with language, it creates a problem. It creates a block. That block has to be avoided. And for that, the key to success is practice. You have to practice every now and then. You cannot say that I am going to practice communication because this is a part of my syllabus. If I'm pursuing my PGDM or MBA course, as I have to go through this subject called business communication, I'm going to revise it and then forget it in the second trimester or second semester. You are going to be in big trouble. Trust me, boys and girls, whosoever are willing to have a bright career in future as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, or as a manager, communication is going to be the key to your success. So therefore, you have to improve this, and this improvement will happen or will come within you only when you are practicing it every now and then. Further moving ahead, when we talk about the other oriented barriers from the sender's point of view, bypassing. Many a times we don't understand and we find it very difficult to connect our thought with the other thought, and so therefore what happens, we misinterpret our own self and then we convey the information in a wrong way, and because the information is conveyed in a wrong way, other person also find it very difficult to understand. So therefore you need to have the right inference in your mind. Whatever you are willing to communicate, it has to reach to the receiver in the right form. That means the interpretation and understanding done by the receiver should be exactly the same that the sender is trying to convey or send. The frame of references can act again as a barrier. There is different perceptions which are made. Because of these perceptions, people may understand it in difficult way. So therefore, how can we get rid of this? By taking up the follow-up or by understanding from the receiver, what did he or she understand? You need to take a pause and you have to find out from the receiver, what is it that he understood? And when you check, when you cross check, you will understand whether the things were rightly communicated or not. Then comes over or under communication. Quantum, the kind of message that you are sharing with the audience or the receiver. Is it too much or too less? Please keep this in your mind. Anything when you are sharing in a huge quantity can become a big difficulty for the other person to interpret. So know what is the right amount of information that you are willing to share, which can be sufficient or which can suffice the need of the audience. Last thing that you have to keep in your mind when you are talking about the perspective of the sender and when you talk as a barrier when you are sending the information is loss in impact. You have to create that right impact, and that right impact could be delivered only when you have clarity in your information. Incomplete information can always keep people in dilemma, can always create confusion. You keep the thoughts always hanging and people come up with different inferences, with a different conclusion. That is a big problem. So therefore you need to share the information incomplete so that people come up with a right structure, with the right thought, and then it could be acting in a right way. Sometimes there are certain barriers which are coming from the receiver side. What are those barriers? Let us understand about each one of them now in detail. The mental turbulence. When I say mental turbulence, it is exactly the mental block which happens in the mind of the sender. Similar blockage can be there even in the mind of the receiver. That creates a confusion in the mind of the receiver. You need to check. You have to confirm whether you are understanding the information in a right way or not. So therefore, certain expressions like, okay, right, I understand, can I repeat, or let me confirm, by saying the statements to the sender, you can recheck, you can cross check whether you understood the information in a right way and interpret it in a right way or not. Ineffective grasp of message. Many times we take with our own notions. If someone says it's a holiday, why is it a holiday? We give our own explanations to it. And so therefore, people may come up with a different explanation. If I'm talking about the kind of problem that we are facing these days, when I'm talking about COVID-19, there can be n number of reasons for the spread of virus. And people may come with n number of thoughts because each person is having his or her own notion. So lack of knowledge can create a big problem and it can act as a barrier. And how do we overcome this? By building, by developing the right information. So therefore, always remember, you have to read, you have to write, you have to. So the moment once when we are talking about the barriers which are from the receiver's point of view. Sometimes it could be ineffective grasp of message. Sometimes it could be partial grasp of message. Half of the part I understood in a right way and half of the part I could not understand in a right way. And I did not cross check from the sender whether I understood in a right way or not. That could again create a problem. And why this happens? This happens because of lack of interest. I did not believe that was so important, so therefore I did not find it from the sender. So you could not understand in a right way. Hence, you have to develop interest and you have to build up that linkage. How can we build up that linkage? By sharing our confirmation, by creating the eye contact, certain time by smile, certain time by certain expressions like, okay, right, I understand. The next barrier is differences in reception and comprehension. What is received and what do you comprehend is totally not at all in synchronization with your thought. Again, it creates a problem. Why this happens? It happens because of the preoccupation, because of your preconceived notions. You have to get rid of those preconceived notions if you really want to create that emphatic expressions and impressions. For that, checking and rechecking will help you a lot. Distancing from the speaker. When you become very judgmental, when you evaluative, and when you say that what speaker knows is not at all that important and I know better than him or her, then again it's a problem. So you have to evaluate only at right points. Don't become too judgmental. And once when you do that, it becomes a problem. Misunderstanding. Many a times we wrongly interpret and then again it becomes a problem. And for that, you have to sort out your differences between the sender and receiver. Bias listening. Now, we are going to talk about listening in detail in the chapter when we are dealing with listening skills. But let us understand what is bias listening. Bias listening happens when you are applying selective listening. This part of communication is useful for me, so let me listen to it. Rest of the time, we don't pay attention and we show our disinterest. So don't get into biased listening. When this happens, trust me, your communication is wrongly inferred or you may be getting carried away with wrong information. Last but not the least, when it comes to the barrier from the receiver's point of view, lack of provision of correct feedback. When you don't give right feedback, when you don't share with the sender the right feedback, the sender will keep on flowing the information and you keep on conveying the wrong things or you are keep on grasping the wrong things. So always remember, it is very important for you to have a right feedback to check whether you understand the things in a proper way or not, so that you can convey the right information to the person accordingly. Moving ahead, there are 7 principles of communication. If you remember in the first session, we talked about impress. Now that impress can happen only when you apply the 7 C's of communication. What are those 7 C's of communication? There has to be clarity of your thought. Once when you are clear with your thought, you can create that right image or right information. Whenever you're sharing that right information, it has to be concise. Remember another acronym, KISS. Keep it simple and short. Always remember, the more simpler your language is, the more shorter your sentences and statements are, it will create a right impact on the audience. So therefore, you have to have clarity in your thought. Then the communication should be concise, concrete. Add on certain facts, add on certain figures, which can add more value to your thought, which can add more value to your information. Always remember, when I'm saying facts and figures, adding information which is relevant, it should be right. Don't bluff. Don't add those kind of information which is wrong. For example, when I said add facts and figures, don't give your own assumptions. Don't give those facts and figures which are actually wrong or which are incorrect. So always remember that whatever you are sharing should be correct. There has to be coherent. When I use the word coherent, it means matching one with the other. If there is no match or if there is still gap between what I'm willing to say and what is conveyed, or whatever the information that I'm sharing is not at all connecting with one to the other, then the communication will create lots of dilemma, lots of confusion, and you cannot be considered as, or it cannot be considered as the right communication. Share the information in a complete form. And finally, Be very courteous when you are communicating. When you apply all these 7 C's, it becomes the best communication, and therefore these 7 C's are also considered as the 7 golden principles of communication. You heard me correct. They are considered, or they are always valued as golden principles of communication. These 7 C's, let me repeat: the clarity, then conciseness, the concreteness, the correctness, the coherence, the completeness, and courteousness. When these are applied, your communication becomes the best one. Why are we talking about these 7 skills? What is the importance of applying these 7 skills? The reason for applying these 7 skills are: there are different tactics, there are different thought processes which are happening in the mind of the sender or the receiver. Sometimes we are dominating, sometimes we remain uninvolved. It is not of my interest. That's not my cup of tea. Why should I step into his shoes? Why should I take it into consideration? There can be so many thoughts. Sometimes we are frequently interrupting. Why? Because I need the support from the listener. I want your attention, so therefore I keep on intervening or interrupting. Sometimes people love to raise too many questions in order to get the clarification about what they are speaking. Every time you hear people saying, okay, all right, do you understand? Okay. So there can be so many cliches, there can be so many redundancy of the same statement, so that people get the confirmation from your end. Dodging. People keep moving from one point to the other point. Sometimes people talk about things in order to get the sympathy, because they want to show up what they feel for you. It is all because of the superiority complex. Sometimes they also try to explain you that I was also in your situation. Why? Because they are talking about their inferiority complex, or they try to show you your inferiority complex. So please remember, there can be different situations based on which the sender or the receiver is going to share their information. You can be dominating, you can be a person with superiority complex, or you can be a person with inferiority complex. You are trying to grab the attention. Sometimes you are trying to grab attention to query. You are interrupting, you are uninvolved, or you are super highly involved. So all these things create a different kind of information or perceptions which are created either on the mind of sender or on the mind of receiver. What is the right way? Let us understand those 10 commandments of communication. This is the last part of our chapter number 2. When we talk about barriers, these barriers can overcome only when we follow these 10 commandments. And what are those 10 commandments? Let us understand. Clarity in objective of communication. Whatever I want to communicate, the clarity should be there. What is the purpose behind my communication? Who are the people? Do I know the people? Do I know what is their interest? Do I understand their purpose? When I understand the purpose of the people, my communication becomes clear. Similarly, the language that I'm using. Say, for example, I'm using English and you don't know what English language is, or you haven't even heard this English language. It becomes very difficult for you to understand this video lecture. So therefore, you need to have understanding of that language. Quantum of communication, how much to be delivered. Too much of information, overloading information can create a problem. Also, there has to be a right choice of medium. What is the way I communicate? What are the provisions that are available with me? Even know about the climatic conditions. When I say climatic condition, where you are taking up this particular session, what is your state of mind? What is your state of body? Everything has to be taken into the consideration. Attentive listening, as I said, instead of having selective listening, it is always preferred that the person whosoever is listening should pay his complete attention. Unintentional communication, that has to be avoided. Don't show too much of your interferences. Don't even try to grab the attention just for the sake of grabbing attention, so that the person can get attracted with your action and then the flow stops, or there is a break of the flow. So always avoid unintentional communication. Also need to corroborate the statements, connect it in a right way. Flow of the communication should be right. If I am talking with anyone, I need to have a proper understanding of the information. If I cannot share that information in the right flow, people may not be able to grab it. Then the ninth point says development of communication is always a two-way process. Wait for the person to reciprocate and to respond. Owning communication skill, it requires lots of practice. Unless and until you don't practice every day, you cannot reach or you cannot build up your communication. So therefore, it is very important to understand this, and you have to practice this. When you practice it always, you become a good communicator. When you follow these 10 commandments, trust me, you overcome the barriers either from the sender's point or from the receiver point, and you share with the people the right information, which will be always accepted by the others. So in this chapter, we discussed about the barriers of communication, the sender's oriented barrier, the receiver's oriented barrier, what are the golden principles of communication, what are the basic mindset which is followed whenever people talk, and what are the 10 commandments that we are going to implement in future if we really want to create that positive impact on the mind of the listener. So when I say you need to really apply these 10 commandments if you want to have that effective communication. That's all in this particular chapter. We are going to come with a new chapter in another video. Till then, keep practicing and keep improving your communication skills. By that time, you are going to enhance and you're going to improve your communication. It will be always good for you all.